The church doors burst open like thunder across the prairie, sending a gust of dust and dying sunlight down the aisle. Every head turned from the altar where Thomas Mitchell stood frozen, his bride's hand trembling in his own. The woman in the doorway swayed against the frame, her once pristine blue dress now stained with travel and desperation, her dark hair falling loose from pins that had given up miles ago. Thomas. The name escaped her lips like a prayer, like a curse. Sarah Beth Chambers. The woman who'd torn his world apart 3 years ago when she'd chosen his brother Jacob over him. The woman who'd left Millbrook with promises of a better life in San Francisco, taking Jacob's heart and Thomas's hope with her. Thomas felt his new bride's grip tighten. Margaret was a good woman, a preacher's daughter from the next county over. She'd agreed to marry him not for love, they both knew that, but for companionship, for the promise of a stable life on his ranch. She deserved better than this spectacle. "Please," Sarah Beth whispered, loud enough for the packed church to hear. "Don't do this." The preacher cleared his throat, his Bible trembling in weathered hands. The congregation sat in stunned silence, their Sunday best suddenly feeling too tight, too formal for the raw emotion spilling down the aisle. Thomas could smell Sarah Beth from where he stood, trailed dust and desperation, the scent of a woman who'd ridden hard for days. "Where's Jacob?" Thomas heard himself ask, though he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. Sarah Beth's face crumpled. She took one unsteady step forward, then another, her boots echoing against the wooden floor like gunshots. Jacob's gone, Thomas. He's been gone for 8 months now." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Gone. His brother, the golden boy who'd always gotten everything he'd ever wanted, including the woman Thomas had planned to marry. Gone, and Sarah Beth was here, in his church, on his wedding day, with tears streaming down her face and something desperate burning in her green eyes. Margaret's hand slipped from his. "What do you mean, gone?" Thomas asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change everything. "Cholera took him in Sacramento." Sarah Beth's voice cracked like a whip across the silent church. "Left me with nothing but debts and memories of what I threw away." Thomas felt the familiar burn of anger rise in his chest, the same fire that had sustained him through 3 years of trying to forget her. "So you come back now? When it's convenient?" "Thomas, please, you chose him." The words came out harder than he'd intended, years of buried pain sharpening each syllable. "You looked me in the eye and told me Jacob was your future. That I was, what did you call it? A safe harbor you didn't want." The congregation shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Young Billy Watson leaned forward in his pew, drinking in every word like it was a dime novel come to life. Sarah Beth stepped closer, close enough now that Thomas could see the dark circles under her eyes, the way her dress hung loose on a frame that had grown too thin. "I was a fool. A scared, stupid girl who thought adventure mattered more than—" She gestured helplessly between them. "More than this. More than you." Margaret stood quietly beside him, her own tears falling silently. Thomas realized with a stab of guilt that she was crying not from heartbreak, but from relief. She'd known, just as he had, that their marriage would be built on foundations of comfort rather than love. "I'm sorry, Margaret," Sarah Beth said, addressing the bride directly. "You're a good woman. Better than I ever was. But I can't let him marry you knowing that I'm still breathing, still hoping that maybe." "Maybe what?" Thomas demanded. "That you can waltz back in here and I'll forget 3 years? Forget the nights I couldn't sleep, wondering what I'd done wrong? Forget watching my own brother take the woman I loved?" Sarah Beth flinched as if he'd struck her. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I hurt you in ways that can't be taken back. But Jacob, before he died, he made me promise something." Thomas felt his resolve wavering. Despite everything, despite the anger and the pain and the public humiliation, he still felt that pull toward her, that magnetic force that had drawn him to her since they were children running barefoot through the wheat fields behind her father's house. "What promise?" Margaret asked quietly, speaking for the first time since the doors had opened. Sarah Beth's eyes never left Thomas's face. To tell you the truth about why I really left. I was pregnant. The words fell into the church like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the congregation. Sarah Beth's hands instinctively moved to her flat stomach, a gesture so achingly familiar that Thomas felt his knees nearly buckle. Pregnant? He whispered. With your child, Thomas. Not Jacob's. Yours. The church erupted in whispers, but Thomas heard none of it. The world had narrowed to Sarah Beth's face, to the truth he saw written there in lines of grief and regret. But you chose Jacob. You left with Jacob. Because I was terrified. Her voice broke completely now, years of holding back the truth finally spilling out. I was 19 years old, unmarried, carrying the child of a man who never even kissed me properly. And Jacob. Jacob offered to marry me, to claim the child as his own. He said it would save my reputation, save your family's name. Thomas staggered backward, the full weight of the revelation hitting him like a horse's kick to the chest. My child? Our son. Sarah Beth reached into her travel bag with shaking hands, pulling out a small tintype photograph. His name was Samuel. He had your eyes, your stubborn jaw. He lived for 6 months before the fever took him. The photograph passed from her trembling fingers to his, and Thomas stared down at the face of a baby he'd never known existed. His son. His and Sarah Beth's son, who'd lived and died without ever knowing his real father. Jacob loved him like his own. Sarah Beth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. He was good to us both, Thomas. But every night, when Samuel would cry, Jacob would look at me and we both knew he belonged to you. Margaret stepped forward, her own face pale but resolute. Thomas, I can't marry you. Not with this between you. Margaret, no. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. She pressed her bouquet into his free hand, her fingers lingering on his for just a moment. I understand that some love runs deeper than sense, deeper than time, deeper than the hurt it causes. You've been carrying her ghost for 3 years. I won't be married to a man whose heart is buried with someone else. Thomas watched his bride walk down the aisle and out of the church, her head held high despite the whispers that followed her. The preacher closed his Bible with a snap that echoed like a gunshot. What do you want from me, Sarah Beth? Thomas asked, still staring at the photograph of his son. I want what I should have asked for 3 years ago. She moved closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her travel-worn body. I want your forgiveness. And if there's any part of you that could love me again, I want a chance to prove that I'll never run away again. The church had emptied around them, leaving only echoes and possibilities hanging in the dusty air between them. They walked in silence to the creek behind the church, the same creek where they'd carved their initials into a cottonwood tree when they were 15. The tree was still there, gnarled and ancient, their young promises still visible in the bark despite years of growth and weather. I used to come here, Thomas said quietly, settling onto a fallen log. After you left, I'd sit right here and try to understand what I'd done wrong. Sarah Beth knelt beside the creek, cupping the cool water in her hands and splashing it on her face. When she looked up, her eyes were clearer, more like the girl he'd once known. You didn't do anything wrong. The mistake was all mine. Tell me about him. About Samuel. She settled beside him on the log, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He was born in winter, during the worst snowstorm San Francisco had seen in years. Jacob paced the floors like an expectant father, brought me tea and held my hand when the pain got too bad. Her voice grew soft with memory. When Samuel took his first breath, Jacob cried harder than I did. But he knew. He knew. Sarah Beth picked up a smooth stone and turned it over in her palm. Jacob loved me, Thomas, but not the way he loved you. He married me to protect our family's honor, all of us. He spent 6 months being the father your son deserved, and when the fever came, she threw the stone into the creek, watching the ripples spread. He held him at the end. Whispered that his real daddy would have been proud. Thomas felt tears he'd held back for 3 years finally begin to fall. I should have been there. You should have been his father from the beginning. That's on me. They sat in the growing dusk, listening to the creek babble over stones worn smooth by time and current. Fireflies began to dance in the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called to its mate. "I married Margaret because she was safe," Thomas admitted. "Because loving her wouldn't destroy me the way loving you did. And now?" Thomas turned to face her fully for the first time since she'd walked through those church doors. In the fading light, she looked older, marked by grief and hardship, but underneath the pain he could still see traces of the girl who'd stolen his heart in Sunday school. "Now I don't know what safe means anymore." Sarah Beth reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing against his hand. "I know I have no right to ask this. I know I broke something between us that might never heal properly. But if you could find it in your heart to try, I promise you, Thomas Mitchell, I will spend the rest of my life proving that you can trust me not to run." Thomas looked down at their joined hands, at the calluses on her palms that spoke of hard work and harder times. "What if it's too late? What if we've both changed too much? Then we'll find out together." 1 year later, Thomas stood in the same church, but this time the doors remained closed. This time, when he looked down the aisle, he saw Sarah Beth walking toward him in a simple white dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers she'd picked that morning from the meadow where they'd buried Samuel's memory. The congregation was smaller this time, just family and close friends who'd watched their story unfold with the patience of people who understood that some love stories take longer to write than others. Margaret sat in the third pew with her new husband, a kind merchant from Denver who looked at her the way Thomas had learned to look at Sarah Beth again, with wonder, with gratitude, with the deep recognition of a gift almost lost. "Do you, Thomas Mitchell, take Sarah Beth Chambers to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." The words came easier this time, weighted with truth and tested by time. "Do you, Sarah Beth Chambers, take Thomas Mitchell to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Sarah Beth's voice was steady, clear as creek water over stone. "I do." Forever this time. When they kissed, Thomas tasted salt. Whether from her tears or his own, he couldn't say. It didn't matter. They'd learned that love wasn't about perfect beginnings, but about perfect commitment to seeing the story through, even when the chapters got messy, even when the plot took unexpected turns. After the ceremony, they walked to the creek together, to the cottonwood tree where their initials had waited patiently through seasons of separation. Sarah Beth pulled a small wooden cross from her bouquet, one Thomas had carved during the long nights of their courtship's second chance. "For Samuel," she said simply. They placed it at the base of the tree, in the space between their carved promises, and Thomas understood that some endings were really beginnings, that some stories had to break before they could heal into something stronger. The sun set behind them as they walked back toward their future, their shadows stretching long across the prairie grass, finally moving in the same direction.